So in Chapter 5, we're going to be talking about for loops. For loops are much like while loops, except that for loops have a counter function or a counter system built right into the way they are set up. Here's a quick overview of what we're going to be going over. Talking about a little about loops again and incrementers and decrementers. We're going to go over what for loops are and how you write them out, what the syntax is, and how they differ from while loops. And we're finally going to go over collision detection so we can get our space shooter asteroids and shots destroying each other. We're going to go over how tags help us detect which objects are what in our game scene. And we're going to cover what CoRoutines are and how they can help us create a more advanced spawning system for our asteroids. Alright, so let's just get into loops. Of course, again, they're just a sequence of instructions repeated always until a condition has been met. If the condition is never met, then we get an infinite loop which crashes our Unity. Here we have our incrementers, which really help with the counting variables that we set up last time in our while loops. Just the simple plus plus will always add 1 to an integer, while minus minus will always subtract 1 to an integer, as seen in this example right here. Alright, so what's a for loop? Well, again, it's just like a while loop, except we have a little bit of a different setup here. In a while loop, we just had a simple conditional check within this parentheses here. But in a for loop, we have two other kinds of statements we need to make, and these two statements help us set up our counter variable and increment our counter variable without using any more lines of code within our body to do so. So let's just go over this bit by bit. So we have our for, and then we do a parentheses, and then we declare our counter variable right here. So integer I equals 0. We have a conditional check, so if I is less than 10, we'll keep doing this loop. And then we have an increment, which would be I++, that counts up our integer variable every time we go through our loop. Notice how we have semicolons separating each of these statements right here. And of course, underneath we just have a body of code which will be filled with instructions to do whatever you want to do within your game. Okay, let's keep going. Here's an example of how you could set up your for loop. Again, my num could be seen as your counter variable. So we have for, open parentheses, int my num equals 0. So that's our declaration of our counter variable right here. We have a semicolon, which separates this statement from our conditional check right here. The conditional check is what we're used to seeing within our while loop. And then we have another semicolon, and then our increment to our counter variable. So let's see our for loop in a more practical setting within Unity. Here I have an empty scene set up, and I have an example script going. And we got a blank slate of a script. So why don't we first just set up a while loop that we were kind of used to in the last lesson. So I'm just going to go while my counter is less than 10. Close that off. Use our curly brackets. And then Unity does that auto formatting. I hit Control Z to undo the formatting. And I get my curly brackets lined up just perfectly. And let's just use a debug.log statement to say something like this while loop is at loop, and then we'll just put a colon, and then so we can know what loop we're in, we're just going to print my counter. That'll be the variable that we're going through in our loop, or our counter variable. And then I got to my counter plus plus, and there's my increment to my counter, but my counter is purple right now. Well, I haven't declared my variable yet, so I need to go up top, public int my counter, using that nice naming convention, lowercase, uppercase. If I hit Control S, we should see in our console a sequence of statements saying this while loop is at loop 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because every variable integer that you declare always defaults to 0. So let's see this in action. And here we go. This while loop is at loop 0, 1, 2, 3. It's looped through our while loop 10 times counting from the number 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Nothing new here. So let's make a for loop that does the exact same thing as our while loop right here. So I'm going to describe for, and then here's where our first difference comes in. I will declare an integer or an integer counter right here, and typically you use just the lowercase I instead of calling it my counter. You can technically call it whatever you want, but for sake of speed and time and cleanliness, typically you would want to use I. And then let's just set it to 1 and see what happens. So our counter is going to start at the number 1, and let's do our conditional check. As long as our counter, which is denoted by lowercase I, is less than 10, we're going to run this loop, and then another semicolon, and then I plus plus, and we'll close it down. So let's look at how this relates to our while loop up here. Of course, we have our conditional check right here, which is the same as our while loop right there. Then we have our integer declaration and assignment, which is basically what we did up here. And then we have our counter increment, which is what we did right here. So 1, 2, 3 lines of code versus 1 line of code. It's a little bit more eloquent, I guess. It saves you time, and you don't have to worry about declaring all these different counters and incrementing them. The for loop does all that stuff for you. So let's just finish it out by adding our curly brackets. And then I can just go in here and copy and paste. Control C to copy, Control V to paste. And I want to make a few adjustments. This is going to be my for loop. And instead of printing my counter, what do you think we'll print instead? How about just that lowercase I? Because for my for loop, my I is my counter. Literally. I'll hit Control S. And let's see what we get in our console window when we press play. The while loop is at 0, 1, 2, 3. We go through our while loop. When it hits 9, we're done here because it's printed 10 times. And then we have our for loop. It starts at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We only go through it 9 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Why is that? It's because I declared my counter to start at 1. If I declared it or assigned it a value of 0, we would get all 10 loops printed out for us. And there we have our for loop starting at 0. So this example right here, this is all of our while loop right here, plus our variable declaration, and this is our for loop right here. And those are the main differences between our for loops and while loops. And in a second, I'll get into our space shooter game that we've been making, and I'll convert our while loop for the asteroid spawner to this for loop. I want to cover a few different other Unity functions and game mechanics that we're going to add to our game and what's going to be due on the assignment. So I'm going to pause this, and I'm going to load up Chapter 5 assets that you can find on your chapter page. So go ahead and download those assets into a brand new assignment called Chapter 5, and we'll start together, and you can follow along, and you can see how I create my collision and get my CoRoutines and my asteroid spawner all set up. Alright, be right back. So I've downloaded Chapter 5 assets to my desktop right here, and I can import it into my new game project that's set up just for Chapter 5. I'm either going to import new assets and browsing for it. What's going on here? It doesn't look like it's doing it. Import package, custom package. And there we have my Chapter 5 assets. Or you can just drag and drop it right on top of your assets here. We'll get our import window. We'll import everything. And now we have Chapter 5 assets, and if you've downloaded this and imported them in, we're both going to be starting at the same spot. And I want you to follow along and work with me, because what I'm about to cover from here on out will be part of this chapter's assignment. And we're going to talk about collision detection real quickly. The easiest way we can solve for collision detection between our objects, which means collision detection basically means when two objects enter each other. So if a bullet enters the space of an asteroid, we'll need to be able to detect when that happens so we can get them to destroy each other. We're going to use a new kind of function called onTriggerEnter, and then parentheses, we'll write collider, and then we'll create a temporary name for what we hit. Alright, there's a few things we got to know when setting up our collision detection. These game objects need to have the following things attached to them. A collider, so like a mesh collider, sphere, or a box. The kind of colliders we've already attached to certain game objects within our level creation so the user couldn't walk through the walls. But instead, we're going to check is trigger to true, and we need to have a rigid body component attached to them. So let's go ahead and see how we can get our scene set up. And maybe all this onTriggerEnter, collider, all this stuff will start to make more sense if we have an example we can work along with. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Scenes and click on Solution. We don't need to save that empty scene. And immediately we have what was going on last time, which is just being able to shoot our pellets. And we have our asteroid spawning. We have our no ammo, low ammo messages going on. Let me do a quick overview of what we got going so far with our scripts. We have our asteroid mover. We open up MonoDevelop by double clicking on that script, which is basically just moving our asteroid prefabs that we can see right here. We have our asteroid mover script attached to my asteroid prefab, and we have a object speed and a lifetime. Let's go back and look at, well, we have a lifetime, but we don't have a destroy function. So why don't we go ahead and update our asteroid mover script to destroy the asteroid after its lifetime that we've set in this variable right here, which is 10 seconds. And we're going to do this by adding a void start function. So we get our curly brackets going, Control Z to undo the formatting, and we're just going to simply write destroy game object lowercase g, comma, and then we're going to give it its lifetime. So within this destroy function, it destroys the game object that the script is attached to, and the second little value it takes is how long until the destroy takes place, and we're just going to put our lifetime variable there. I'll hit Control S to save, and now my asteroids will destroy themselves after 10 seconds have gone by, or whatever value you want to make lifetime equal. Alright, so let's go over our bullet mover. This is a little bit more complex because not only do we have a speed and lifetime that we saw over here within our asteroid mover, but we need to describe where the shot is spawned, and we do that by setting the shot spawn variable to the location of our medium fighter right here. And we do that through these lines of code. Alright, here's our destroy that destroys our bullet after its lifetime. And here's the line of code that matches the transform of the bullet to the transform of our shot spawn, which we set equal to our medium fighter in this line of code right here. Alright, and our update just moves our bullet to the right using a transform.translate function that we've used before in previous lessons. So nothing new with our bullet mover. Here's our player fire script. This was part of the assignment for, I think, Chapter 3. Right now we just have a series of nested if statements within our update function. So the first if statement we're going to check for is if the user presses the spacebar. So if the user does press the spacebar, Unity's going to go through these 3 if statements to check the status of the ammo count right here. So if our ammo is greater than 3, no problem. We'll just shoot the bullet and we'll de-increment how much ammo is in our pouch here or in our weapon banks. But the more we shoot, the more ammo count is going to take away from our initial value of 10. And eventually, our ammo count is going to drop below 3. So if our ammo count is less than or equal to 3, and it's above 0, so right in between 3 and 0 is where we're going to want to print low ammo. Alright? So if our ammo count descends below 0, notice this double ampersand here. This basically means that both these conditions must be true to do this line of code right here. So if our ammo count is less than equal to 3, then yes, 0 is less than 3. But if our ammo count is 0, then it is not greater than 0. So this statement would be false, and we would skip this else if statement right here, and we would just jump to our last else statement, which would be just a no ammo message right here. Alright, so that's how our player fire system is set up right now. If we look at our player mover script, we went over this last chapter. Basically, we converted a transform.translate method of moving our player to using a rigid body velocity method by attaching oh yeah, we'll need to do this again. We don't have a rigid body on our ship anymore. Well, we have it on our I see what's happened. This is a good example of when this happens. The medium fighter, the player ship loaded into our scene, has our rigid body component added to it. But if we go to our medium fighter prefab, we can see that we don't even have the player fire or player mover or rigid body attached to it. So if I just go back to the medium fighter in my scene that has all the good scripts I want to it, see how I have this prefab line here? I want everybody to follow along and do this. We're just going to hit apply. If we go back to my medium fighter ship, now all of those nice scripts and components are added to my medium fighter prefab. Alright. And the last script we're going to look at is our asteroid spawner. This was what we had to solve for in our last assignment. So I believe the main thing was to get our timer working with our while loop. So I did this by declaring an update while my asteroid counter is less than my spawn count. So this is going to be our incremental asteroid count that we had right here. And then I just simply added my timer right below my while loop. And then I started my if statement for my timer. So if my timer is greater than the spawn wait, which is declared right here at 2 seconds, then I'm going to go through and we'll do this while loop. So every 2 seconds we'll go through this while loop. Later in this video, we're going to go over how we can get around this kind of tricky way to set up this timer to add pauses between our asteroid spawns. This is not the most eloquent way of describing making waves of asteroids, but for what our skill level was last chapter, it was a nice little exercise to wrap our heads around while loops and time.delta time. Alright, so let's go ahead and start setting up our collision in our scene real quickly. I'm going to get rid of some of these things right here. Alright, the first thing I want to talk about are tags. Basically, tags are levels we can assign to multiple objects in our scene. These tags can be used in our code to affect every single object with the same tag, and you'll see how that'll work in a second. And there's some pre-made Unity tabs. We can make our own custom tabs, And I use tags a lot because I like using them to find multiple objects within my scene in my code. So if I need to affect multiple objects in my scene in the scripts, like destroy a bunch of different things, I can set up a tag, and everything under that tag I can destroy with some lines of code. Let's see how we can use tags within our scene right here. Alright, so let's go to our prefabs folder, and we're going to have to set up tags for all three of our prefabs we have loaded right now. So let's do it for our medium fighter first. So if we go to our inspector over here, you can see we have a tag drop-down menu, and we have all these pre-made tags that we have inside of Unity. Alright, so we can just simply set our medium fighter to player. I believe I accidentally set asteroid to player. If you ever accidentally set game object to the wrong tag, you can just set it to untagged right there to undo that. And I believe in the asset package I have, there was a bullet and hazard tag already created for you. But I went ahead and deleted them, and I'm going to show you how I made those custom tags for you. I'm going to select my bullet, go to the tag drop-down menu. We're going to go to add tag. And within element 0, we're just going to write bullet. And I want to point out that case sensitivity is in play here. So if you use the lowercase bullet that was already included in your assets, that's fine. Just remember what case you were using, lowercase b or this uppercase b that I just created. And why don't we go to asteroid, and why don't we call this a hazard? I didn't call it asteroid because what if I wanted to add space debris or other different kinds of game models later in the future that act as hazards? Well, it wouldn't make much sense to have a tag, space debris tagged as an asteroid. So I just created a general hazard tag here. And notice that whenever I create that tag, I still have to go back and assign it that newly created hazard tag right here. So now my prefabs all have tags. And by updating my medium fighter prefab, and went ahead and updated the medium fighter I have within my active game scene right here as player. So tags are really nice. They're all set up. We have a hazard for my asteroid, a bullet tag for my bullet, and a player tag for my medium fighter. That all makes sense. The next thing we need to do is set up colliders for all of my game objects. And let's go ahead and just do that for my prefabs here. For my medium fighter, I'm going to go to Add Component. We're going to go to Physics. And let's just do a Mesh Collider since it's a odd-shaped object here. So you probably remember doing that from making your level. The biggest difference here is instead of the Mesh Collider acting as a physical boundary that we cannot walk through, it's actually going to be a trigger for our collision detection. So I'm going to click Is Trigger to True. Do not forget this step. It could be one of the reasons why your collision won't be working if you have problems in the future. So make sure our Is Trigger is set to True. And we're just going to do that for all of my prefabs here. And since my asteroid and bullet are all spherical, I'm just going to go ahead and add them, add sphere colliders to them. Remember to check Is Trigger, Physics. We go to Add Component, Physics, Sphere Collider, and it is a trigger for my collision detection, so we'll check that to be true. The last step we need to do to get our prefab set up for collision detection is we need to add rigid body physics to them. It's just the way that the onTrigger enter function works. If a rigid body is not attached to them, the function will not recognize it as a collidable object. So I already have one on my medium fighter because that's how my player mover script worked. But I don't have them attached to my bullet or my asteroid. So I'll select my bullet prefab. Remember, we're still in prefabs. We'll go to Add Component, Physics, just give it a rigid body. And one thing we got to tweak is we want to turn gravity off. Otherwise, our bullets are going to go wrong and just kind of Well, I'll just show you what happens if we got our rigid body and keep gravity on. Notice how our bullets just kind of sink. But if we turn it off, if we turn off gravity, we get those straight shots again. So don't forget to turn off gravity on your rigid body. Let's go to asteroid prefab, and let's add a rigid body to it and turn its gravity off. And now all three of my prefabs have a collider on them and a rigid body on them. And now our onTriggerEnter function that we're about to code up will work for us. So to make things easier, since everything around the game involves colliding with asteroids, whether it's my bullets hitting the asteroids or my ship itself, why don't we just create a collision script for my asteroids? Alright, so why don't we just go to scripts right here. I'll right click in some empty space, create C# script, and let's call this collision. I'll double click on collision here. And we have a blank canvas we can work on. So let's get the formatting I like to do set up. I just like to get my curly brackets lined up with each other so it's a little bit easier to read. The less confused and lost you get in your code, the better, especially when you're starting out. Alright, so instead of using a void update or a void start function, let's get rid of those. And we're going to create a new void statement. Public void, and here's that onTriggerEnter function you kept hearing me talk about. Notice every word is capitalized within this. Be sure to get your capitalization on point. So on is capitalized, trigger is capitalized, enter is capitalized. And then in my parentheses, I'm going to have a collider parameter set. And right here might be one of the trickiest things about it. We're going to declare a temporary variable that's local only to the script that we call any object that we're going to collide with, that our asteroid is going to collide with. So I'll just call this other object and set my curly bars. Why? That's probably a weird concept to get your brains around. Why is this like this? Well, our collider is going to check for the colliders on our objects. And our other object is that temporary local variable. Well, we have to have a flexible variable here because our asteroid is going to be colliding with either my ship right here, or it can collide with my bullets. If we didn't have a flexible variable here, we would have to declare a variable for every single possible object in our scene that the asteroid could collide with. So the function is really smart in that it just uses a blanket flexible other object variable here that, can 1 second be the player, another second be the asteroid, and it all depends on what our asteroid is colliding with. So for the actual code for this, within my onTriggerEnter function here, and this function just tests for whether or not let me bring in this asteroid to the scene real quick. See this green sphere? That's our collider, right? And our ship has a mesh collider, so the blue net is what's going to be our collider. So as soon as this green cage collides and intersects with my ship here, then this function is going to start running. See, the trigger right here, the trigger sphere collider, enters my ship onTriggerEnter. And that's why that function is called like it is. We'll just get that asteroid out. So my asteroid has entered my player. I need to do one thing real quickly. I need to make a check to see if whatever object I've collided with is the player. So I'll just write if other object, which is that flexible local variable name we have right here, dot tag, which means whatever object I just collided with, I'm going to look at its tag, dot tag right here. If that tag equals player, notice that's in parentheses or quotation marks, then we're going to do some code here. And these tags allow us to create a bunch of different things to happen depending on what we hit. So let's say that the bullet didn't outright destroy our asteroid, but whenever it collides with a player, it does destroy the asteroid. We would need to have the difference between recognizing a player or a bullet, because the player destroys the asteroid, but the bullet only chips away at its health bar. But for the sake of simplicity, our bullets and our player are both going to destroy the asteroids in one hit. So what happens if we collide with a player and its tag is indeed player? What are we going to do? Well, let's use some destroy calls. We're going to destroy the other object, which in this case is our player. So think of this as our player or our medium fighter here. And destroy needs game object always. So .game object. Basically, we're destroying the game object of the medium fighter. Alright, and we can close that out. But let's also say that we want the asteroid to destroy itself when it hits the player. So when the asteroid collides with our player, it's going to destroy the player as well as itself, because, you know, if a big asteroid hits something, you would think it would break apart and be destroyed as well. So in this instance, we're just going to use the simple game object without any kind of variable before it. This will destroy the game object that the script is attached to. This will destroy the game object that has been collided with. Alright, we hit Control S to save. And then we need to get my collision script. Wait a minute. How am I going to get my collision script on my asteroid prefab? Well, in this case, we can just select my asteroid prefab. I can go to Add Component. We can go to Scripts and assign it my collision script. This is just another way where you can assign your own custom scripts to different game objects. So now that my asteroid has my collision script attached to it, let's see what happens. Alright, I'm going to press play here. Alright, notice my bullets don't do anything yet, but if I hit that asteroid, boom, both of us are destroyed. So let's set something up to catch my bullets as well. I could do copy and paste this, but set the player tag to bullet. So we have if other objects tag is bullet, then it's going to destroy the bullet and the asteroid as well. I'll hit play. Boom, boom, boom. Now our asteroids are being destroyed. A quicker way we could have done this, if our bullet and our player both behave the same way, I could have done double straight brackets. Which means or. If the other game tag equals player or the other game tag equals bullet, we'll do this code here. Boom, boom, boom. And now we have things destroying each other within our scene here. With just, what? Maybe 5 lines of code, if that, maybe 6. So all it took was a little bit of preparation on our prefabs and a few lines of code. Alright, so that does it for collision. And here's an example of what we just kind of coded up here. Now let's talk about CoRoutines. CoRoutines, main use I have for them are acting like the timer we made with time.delta time in our last lesson. Here's a link for any more information you may want to have. Well, my internet's down right now. That's not good. Well, anyway, this link will take you to the manual for CoRoutines so you can read more about them. And this link will actually take you to a video tutorial that describes CoRoutines on Unity's website. But I just want to go ahead and just bang out and show how CoRoutines will work within our scene, how the syntax works, so we can get a better understanding of how CoRoutines work without getting too much into the back end of it. Alright, so let's go to my scripts, and we have asteroid spawner right here. And we have these lines of code that create a wave of asteroids that spawn once, and our timer creates these pauses between our asteroids. So 1, 2, 2. And we can increase our spawn weight to every 2 seconds if we wanted. And there's our timer resetting after every asteroid spawning. So our interval is longer. But what if we wanted to have multiple waves of asteroids coming at us, and not just one wave? Well, CoRoutines and for loops are going to give us that ability. So I'm going to do this in 2 steps. First, I'm going to rewrite my update function so it uses the while loop and the coroutine. And then once we get our head around the coroutine working with our while loop, then I'll convert our while loop to our for loop. And we can see a few different topics in our lecture come together working for us, and we'll have a really cool asteroid spawning game manager for our final game we're going to make. Alright, so basically I'm just going to get rid of everything. Alright, I'm going to need all these variables. Yep, still going to need all the variables. The biggest difference we're going to do is we're going to change our void update to void start. Okay. You know what? We may need to reuse some of that code that we just had. Well, I don't want to have to destroy all my code. Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't I just take all this code right here. I'll go to edit and cut. I'll do a / and asterisk, which is Shift 8. I'll paste this old code. And at the bottom, I'll go down a few lines. I'll do an asterisk and /. These guys right here will comment out any code in between. So we have the beginning of the comment out and the end of the comment out. This allows me to look at my old code as I write some new code, because I'm going to want to probably use some of these lines again. So now that I've done that, I'm going to turn this void update into a void start. Alright, so the first line of code to get my coroutine working is I'm going to go to say and write start coroutine, and I need to give my coroutine a name. So let's call it spawn asteroids. Alright, I'll do a space. The spawn asteroid has its own set of parentheses here, and then I need to close off the parentheses that we found right here. So we have the 2 parentheses right here that belong to each other, and then the 2 parentheses that belong to each other over there. Then I press semicolon, and that's it for void start. But you'll notice that I gave my coroutine a name, spawn asteroids, but it's pink. That usually means that you've declared something without giving it any kind of assignment, or really declared it at all. You just wrote just a random name right here. So how do we get my coroutine made? Well, kind of like on enter trigger, or void start, or void update, my coroutine is going to be its own thing. So outside of my void start, I'm going to write IE numerator, right there. That's how we start naming our coroutine. And then we're going to give it the same name we did up there, spawn asteroids. And then let's give it those parentheses again. And just like any kind of if statement or update function or void start function, we're going to give it curly brackets. And this is where the meat and potatoes of our asteroid spawning is going to lie. So why don't we do this? Let's say while my asteroid counter, just like we have right here, is less than my spawn count, what's going on here? Spawn count, and let's just be a weird pink occurrence. Set up my curly brackets for my while loop. Control Z to undo that formatting. What are we going to do here? Let's say, well, while this is, so if I'm going to be using a coroutine to get rid of my timer, I guess it goes to show that I won't be needing any of this timer stuff. So I can probably get rid of this timer variable up here. And you'll see how we can add pauses because we have this coroutine declared right here. So why don't we just do our normal code that we had right here. Control C, and we'll just put it into the body of that while loop. Alright, notice how I left off my timer and my if timer statement. We don't need anything that has that timer in it because my coroutine is going to take care of it itself. So you're asking, well, how do I add pauses in between every time an asteroid spawns? Well, here's the beauty of a coroutine function that we've created here. We can simply write yield, and this is going to be some new syntax for you. Yield return new, and then we're going to wait for seconds, and then we have a spawn wait variable already described up here. Well, okay, how many seconds do I want to wait for? How about spawn wait? So if my spawn wait is a variable of 2, or yeah, my float spawn wait is set to 2, then yield return new rather, and then wait for seconds, and then my spawn wait time. Every time we go through this while loop, we'll set my random y to the random range. I'll set my spawn position. I'll instantiate my asteroid. I'll increment the asteroid counter, and then I'll wait for 2 seconds before I go to the top of my while loop again. Alright, why don't we see what happens if I press Control S. Let's just make sure we're not getting an infinite loop. Nope, I have that asteroid counter going up. Starts at 0. Alright, let's see what happens, I guess. So I'll select my game manager. Why don't we set my spawn count to 10? We'll hit play. It's kind of functioning like it was a second ago. Not much has changed, right? There we go. My asteroid counter is counting up every single time. And when it hits 10, and then no more asteroids spawn. So we're almost there. We figured out how we could get our coroutine to add pauses without having to mess with time.delta time. But we still can't get wave after wave coming at us. Why don't we try a new little approach? Let's add some more code here. So basically, in my void start, Unity is going to say, okay, start this coroutine. What's it called? Spawn asteroids. It's going to look for spawn asteroids, i.e. enumerator. So start with coroutine, boom, it's going to look for this. It's going to execute all this code here. But because it's in the start function, it only runs this code once. One time at the beginning of your game. Well, what if we change this to void update so that it's updating every single time we go through it? Let's see what happens there. And I'm going to save. Oh, let me exit this. I'm going to save my scene and my project. I don't want to get stuck in an infinite loop and lose all of my progress. Save project, save scene. Let's go. Oh, well, crap. That didn't work too good. Let's press play again and notice how the counter, it just doesn't work. The while loop gets all messed up. We're calling that coroutine over and over again. And all the hard work we did to get pauses in between the spawns just aren't working. So let's change this back to start. That didn't work out. Well, if the problem is this while loop only runs once, this is going to be crazy. But why don't we just nest it inside another while loop that always runs? You say, hey, that's an infinite loop. How can you do that? Well, if you don't believe me, why don't we just look? Alright. And let's get my spawn wait time between asteroids set down to a normal value. 5. That's 5. And then the next wave, 5. And then immediately we do get that infinite loop. So we're missing some code here. Well, I think I know what happened. We never had anything to reset my counter here back to 0, so when we hit our while loop again, we could cleanly go through it with it starting at 0. Alright, well, let me restart Unity and bring this back up, and we can fix this. Okay, I got my project pulled back up. Good thing I saved it for that, right? It's almost like I knew I was going to crash it. Alright, well, we know that we want these waves to spawn over and over again. We know we want there to be a pause between the waves, so it's almost like we're going to need a new wait variable here. So let's go ahead and describe one. I'm going to declare a public float, and let's call this wave wait. And let's set it to maybe 4.0f for 4 seconds. And then every time I go through this true while loop, this infinite loop, I'm going to need to reset the counter back to 0 so we don't crash it again. And while we're at it, why don't we do a new wait for seconds? This time we'll add a pause for the wave. So right outside of my initial while loop that we wrote, why don't we add 2 things? Let's do a new yield, return, new, and then we'll wait for seconds again. But this time, let's wait for wave wait. And then, just to make sure I don't crash myself again, why don't we turn my asteroid counter, bring up my asteroid counter and set it to 0. And we'll hit save. So let's just talk through what's going on with my code right now. As soon as my game starts, I'm going to start this coroutine. It's called spawn asteroids. So Unity's going to look for spawn asteroids right here. And the first thing it sees is a while loop that's set to true. Normally you would think that would break or crash your Unity, but within our while loop we have a set of instructions that always have something to do. That's not just stuck spinning its wheels. So within my while loop I have another while loop that checks for the number of asteroids that have been spawned versus how many I want to spawn. We do our usual instantiation of my asteroid, and then we wait for 2 seconds before we go to the top of this while loop again. We do this maybe 5 or 10 times depending on what our spawn count is, and then eventually this conditional statement will be false, so it skips all this code, and then it can continue to this code, and we have a wait for seconds that tells us to wait for our wave 4 seconds. It waits for 4 seconds, then it resets our counter variable So when we go back to the top of our while loop, our first while loop here, we come back down to our nested while loop yet again, and instead of it crashing Unity, asteroid counter is now set at 0, ready to start counting up again, and we just repeat this process over and over and over. I'll hit Control S to save, and I'll press play. And I want you to keep your eyes on a few things. I've set my spawn time to every half second I want a new asteroid to spawn, and once 10 asteroids have spawned, I want to wait 3 seconds, and I want you to keep your eye on the counter right here and see how the code resets itself every single time. So I hit play. And notice how we're counting up to 10. It gets to 10 asteroids, it waits 3 seconds, and you'll see it resets itself. And now we get an infinite loop of 10 asteroids spawning every 3 seconds. And I just killed myself. Wow, we're already starting to see a game come together here, right? You can kind of see how some gameplay's coming around. Especially now that I got collision taken care of. And we only have 10 bullets, so it's more like a survival game. How far can you get while only having 10 bullets to fly through the asteroid fields with a little bit of breathing room before the next wave starts? Alright, so basically we have a game at this point. It's not a very good game, it wouldn't make any money, but we're actually playing something right now that has an objective and a pretty decent gameplay loop. The last thing I'm going to do for us, and we're going to work alongside of me, is I'm going to convert that while loop in my spawn. We're going to turn this while loop into a for loop, okay? And then after that, I'm going to give you your brain buster of the week of how we can use the same kind of logic that we're describing here with our for loop and our coroutine to create a burst fire function for our player ship. Alright, but before we get into that, before I describe your project assignment, let's get in and just get our hands dirty and turn this while loop into a for loop. Alright, so I mean it's pretty easy. We're going to leave this while loop where it is because this is going to be keeping us infinitely spawning our waves. What we really want to change is this conditional check while loop. So why don't we go and say for instead of while. Let's get rid of that counter because remember our for loop describes it for us and we need to get rid of it up there. So I'm going to say int I equals 0 semicolon. If I, which is the counter I just described, is less than spawn count, then we're going to do all the code in the body. And every time we go through the loop, we're going to add 1 to our I. And notice you already see a few things here. You see asteroid counter right here, the increment, and the reset to 0. You're going to see it turn pink. Well, we can get rid of these lines of code. Well, if we get rid of that, if we get rid of this line of code right here, won't we get stuck in that infinite loop again? Well, that's one of the beauties of the for loop. Every time the for loop goes through and I no longer becomes less than spawn count, basically when the condition has been met here, I will always reset to 0 because we'll go through our for loop 10 times to spawn 10 asteroids, and then we'll wait for 3 seconds right here. We'll go back to the top of my I enumerator asteroids. Again, we'll see another while loop that's always true. And then when we hit this for loop again, what's the first thing we see? I equals 0. So we already have this line of code handled right here. We already have this line of code handled right here. If I can just add another plus sign right there. So we don't need them anymore. See how useful for loops are? A bunch of random, making sure I don't get infinite loops and making sure I'm incrementing stuff and resetting the value to 0. All that's taken care of us by this for loop. It just handles itself. It's pretty nice. So I'll hit Control S, and at this point I think I can get rid of this code down here. And this for loop should behave in the same way as my while loop did. Notice how I don't have the counter variable anymore. I think I'm already destroyed. But I don't need it anymore. The for loop just does it itself behind the scenes. And I have so much flexibility now. I can position my X to spawn behind the scene again. I think I should have done -6 and 5. I can get my asteroids to spawn really fast, big clumps, maybe every 5 seconds, so I get a big clump of asteroids that I have to fight my way through until the next big clump of asteroid comes 5 seconds later. And what if I want to spawn 50 asteroids really fast? This is just insane mode right here. Oh, can't make it too hard. 10 bullets aren't going to cut it there. Notice how we have a lot of randomness going on here. That's because we have random positions here, and we have a lot of asteroids being spawned. And you'll notice that my asteroids, after 10 seconds, my asteroids are taking care of themselves. So my hierarchy is growing and shrinking on the fly. As you can see the bar going up and down. And now my game manager has a really flexible spawning system to get the asteroids going on my screen. Alright, so what's the assignment for this week? Well, I'll go ahead and pull up the solution so you can see what I expect. Alright, so I got the solution pulled up here. And what I want you to accomplish this week is I want you to take that same asteroid spawning feature here that creates those waves. I want you to apply it to whenever I right click my mouse, boom, 3 shots come out. Burst fire mode. Boom, 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 boom. See how we shoot 3 bullets each time I press the right mouse? And you'll notice I've given myself more ammo. Alright, so where do I start? How do I start this process? Alright. If I select my ship, the first thing you'll see different about my player fire script is not only do I have 50 bullets now, just because I said I wanted to play around with 50 bullets, but I now have a burst interval variable here. This variable will control how fast the bullets spawn with one another. So if I set it to 0.5 instead of 0.02, boom, 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 boom. It almost just looks like I'm firing as fast as I can. But if I set it to 0.001, boom, I get a nice, quick, concentrated spray of bullets. So this burst interval variable functions basically the same way as spawn wait does. Alright. And here's my old fire script. What you're probably going to want to do is you're just going to want to get rid of all this code right here. And we're instead of using space, we're going to use mouse 0. I want your left click to fire a single shot. And mouse 1 will be your right click. I want it to have a coroutine that fires 3 bullets every time you click your right mouse button. Alright, so it'll have a start coroutine right here. And then you're going to have your own separate burst fire coroutine. So this was called spawn asteroids. I would call mine burst fire. And you're just going to use the same basic logic as seen right here. Ignore this while loop and ignore that wave wait. You're going to want to focus on this block of code right here. Get the same kind of functionality to shoot your bullets out. Spawn wait will be your interval fire. And we'll need to instantiate a bullet. And you'll need to use your for loop. You have to use a for loop to fire exactly 3 bullets with a wait for second pause in between each one. I don't want to say too much more because I might as well just code it out for you. But you know what you have to do? You have to turn your player fire script into a new player's fire script that has single shots on mouse 0, which is left click, and a 3-round burst using a coroutine and for loop on your right click. Alright, good luck. If you have any questions, please email me. I'll be happy to help you with any kind of syntax errors or logic problems you may be having. Thank you.